Okay, for my final presentation this afternoon for this wonderful seminar that we had, a good conference. I love the Pacific Northwest. Can't wait to come back here again and be able to share with you some more evidences for creation. And so the last hurrah for this afternoon, I'm going to talk about human evolution. Well, because of the time factor, I think you could see that the phrase human evolution is what? It's a oxymoron, right? So in other words, what you've heard throughout this weekend is that dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs, people have always been people, fish have always been fish, insects have always been insects, and all that. So when we get to the last hurrah here this afternoon talking about human evolution, should it be any surprise that there's no evidence for human evolution? Clearly, ladies and gentlemen, there's no evidence for any other kind of evolution going on except for minor variation, which we do not call evolution. We call it minor variation within the created kind. So yeah, human evolution, just even to begin with, certainly does not fit the evidence whatsoever. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at that. By the way, it's always good to start with a joke. Nothing like a good joke. Oh, he can walk upright. He just hasn't had his coffee yet. Nothing like a good joke to get things started, and that was nothing like a good joke. But in a way, a background, it's not like I am a graduate of Billy Bob's Backwater Bible Baptist College and School of Electric Fan Repair. I went to the University of Northern Colorado. My professor was an atheist. He was very upset when he found out that I was a church attender. And he said, all of my graduate students must take a course in evolution. I said, that was fine. I would go ahead and do that. So I was spoon-fed evolution both as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student at the University of Northern Colorado. I'd like to begin with a quote here, just kind of set the stage for human evolution. This comes from Colbert's Evolution of the Vertebrates. It was published in the early 2000s, but it's just as apropos today as it was back about 15 years ago when this quote was said. Nothing has really changed. Perhaps no aspect of evolution has received such intense study as human evolution. Yet, this is a subject concerning which there is much debate. That hasn't changed at all, ladies and gentlemen. There is more debate about so-called human evolution than when this was said a number of years ago, and about which there is much still to be learned. They will always be in debate. They will always try and learn about human evolution only because, ladies and gentlemen, they will not accept the alternative, which is that we have been created in God's image. And so they will constantly, just like they're looking for those missing links, they will constantly look for this transitional form, these missing links that would somehow connect us with ape-like ancestors, which in turn would connect us with reptiles and fish and so forth. This is a phylogenetic tree. Phylogenetic, when you hear that word, just think the word evolution. That's what it means. This is an evolutionary tree, the primate phylogenetic tree. And it shows the various groups of primates that we see today. You can go to a zoo, as you've heard me said before, as we looked at all the other animals, and you can see in the tidal pool all sorts of animals, the clams and crustaceans and the bivalves, and you can look and see the echinoderms and all that. Well, same situation here. At the top of the screen, you can see all the various kinds of primates in any zoo in the world. And then, of course, they have the hominids. So you have people on the far right-hand side there. But there's a word here, right in the center of the screen, that is called Dryopithecines. Do you see that red word, Dryopithecines? Okay. Well, in Solomon's biology textbook in 2011, just a few years ago, Solomon and her co-author said, quote, Dryopithecines may have given rise to modern apes as well as to humans. Notice those two key words, may have. May have. They simply do not know for sure. It's nothing more than a theoretical construct. And that all of these creatures, including the Dryopithecines, come from the early prosimians millions of years ago. And again, the early prosimians, there's no indication whatsoever that those gave rise then to other early prosimians. Primates have always been primates. Does that sound familiar? Right? You bet. Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. Fish have always been fish. Primates appeared in neotropical faunas. Now, you see that word a lot in evolutionary literature when it says that something appeared That's exactly what they mean. Poof, there it is. It appeared, or that group of animals appeared in the neotropical faunas during tertiary times. Poof, it just appears, although it is difficult to say just how or from where. So they know it evolved, they don't know how it evolved, they don't know where it evolved. Just that what? It evolved. But the specifics, the pesky specifics like how and where remain unknown. Apes have always been apes. Almost as soon as apes appear in the fossil record, said Scientific American in 2003, there are lots of them. That's exactly what we say, folks. We say apes have always been apes. When they find apes in the fossil record, we're not surprised that they show up completely full and fully formed as apes. Another evolutionary publication said, again, it's Colbert, who said most of the apes of the Pleistocene and recent times probably arose. There's the wiggle words. Probably arose from the Miocene and Pliocene Dryopithecines. And there's that word again, Dryopithecines, which may have given rise to these ape-like creatures. Well, there's something I want to clarify this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, because so many people say, well, look, if we evolved from the apes, why do we still have apes? Have you heard that before? If we evolved from apes, why do we still have apes? The evolutionist kind of chuckles when they hear that, because that's not what evolution says at all. Evolution says millions of years ago you had an ancestor that both gave rise to the apes in one group and to people in the other group. And as it says up on the screen there, they diverged. So millions of years ago you had a common ancestor of apes and of people. And from this common ancestor diverged the apes and the people into two very separate groups that we have today. And so the evolutionists posit, they suggest, that's all they can do, that the apes and people came from an unknown evolutionary common ancestor millions of years ago down here, and that's where it diverged. So you see that? So that's their stock answer. It's an out for the evolutionists. They say that's why you have apes today and you have people today. We came, they say, from a common ancestor through this process called divergence. Evolutionary divergence of humans from chimpanzees, what's the word there? Likely occurred some 8 million years ago, rather than the 5 million year estimates widely accepted by scientists, a new statistical model suggests. So there's lots of wiggle words, the vocabulary that you read in the evolutionary literature that say likely and suggest and perhaps and maybe and appeared are words that you see there. And it's good as a non-scientist if you read some of these things, if you read it in your high school, junior high, or college textbooks, to watch out for words like this. Here's another divergence quote from another secular source. This is Alibi. Michael Alibi wrote the 2014 edition of the Dictionary of Zoology. Alibi hates creationists and even shows up in this Dictionary of Zoology. I don't have time to get into that. But Alibi said, quote, the time at which the hominid line diverged from that of the African apes, remember that divergence, and by the apes he means the gorilla and chimpanzees, is what? Is controversial. It's controversial. And again, we would say as creationists that it will always be controversial. And this comes from none other than the Trends in Ecology and Evolution, volume 24, where the secular authors said, there is uncertainty over the exact timing of the human-chimpanzee divergence. So right from the get-go, ladies and gentlemen, we find that this whole idea of divergence, that we as a group of Homo sapiens, 100% people, supposedly diverged from this ape-like stock 8 to 5 million years ago, whoever you want to talk to. And by the way, when you see that progression of the chimpanzees that are down here and then slowly making their way up to the 100% human being that we have today, that's called the linear progression. And guess what? Even the evolutionists are now admitting, to their credit, I salute them, they are admitting that that's not what evolution says anymore. So they've fine-tuned that portion of human evolution. The once popular fresco showing a single file of marching hominids becoming ever more vertical, tall, and hairless now appears to be fiction. So every time you see that, either in a museum diorama or in secular textbooks or whatever else, Just remember that that now appears to be fiction according to evolutionists themselves, Nature Magazine, volume 403. Here's another quote from Tim White, and Tim White debated my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Duane Gish. Duane Gish is now with the Lord, but Tim White got very, very emotional debating Duane Gish. And Tim White said the unilineal depiction of human evolution popularized by the familiar iconography of an evolutionary march to modern man has been proven wrong for more than a half century. So don't buy into that. We don't buy into human evolution at all, any aspect of human evolution, but this is just one part which is no longer believed even by the evolutionists themselves. So here's the key question of the afternoon. You can kind of see the shadow there. What is the tool used in human evolution studies? The one tool that is used most often by human evolution studies is the tool of imagination. Imagination. And boy, has that got an interesting history when it comes to human evolution. Here, the auntie or the mom or whatever, the nurse, is talking to young Charles Darwin. And she says, the princess kissed the frog and it changed into a handsome prince. And young Charles Darwin is saying, boy, when I grow up, I'm going to write stuff like that. I thought it was funny. And I've actually received static from non-creationists in the audience, and we have evolutionists from time to time that come to creation conferences for one reason or another, but I get confronted once in a while by showing this cartoon. And that's not what evolutionists say, and how dare you make fun of evolution and all that. That's not my purpose, not the purpose of the organization that I represent, to denigrate or make fun at the expense of the evolutionist. We want to reach the evolutionist. We want them to receive Christ and be wonderfully born again, John chapter 3. But I have to go where the evidence leads. And this is a quote from an individual a number of years ago where this individual said, one's imagination must fill up the very wide blanks. One's imagination must fill up the very wide blanks. Who said that? Somebody named Charles Darwin. In his letter to an individual, 5 September of 1857. So here, Charles Darwin, 2 years before of his infamous book publication, said, you know, you got to use your imagination to fill up the very wide blanks. Here's the point we're making in creation science circles. If a creationist said something like this, you would never hear the end of it from the evolutionary community. They would never let you forget that a creationist said something like that. And all I want to say this afternoon is turn around is fair play. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Okay, and that's a point that we're making. This comes from Time Magazine. Now, the reason why I include Time Magazine in the mix is because Time Magazine and Newsweek Magazine and virtually all the other news magazines have never been friends of the Christians or the creationist. And Time Magazine said, quote, the only certainty in this data poor, what's the next phrase? Imagination rich. Data poor, imagination rich. Ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the way to describe the human evolution studies. It is data poor, but it sure is imagination rich. Endlessly fascinating field is that there's plenty of surprises left to come. Well, certainly there is. There is, and we continue to look at human evolution and be kind of amused at some of the conclusions that they come to. Like from the trees. This is interesting, and this came from back in 2012, just 4 years ago, from a secular science writer who said, an important moment in our history was abandoning a lifestyle in the trees. Well, how do they know that? I mean, there's so many things you can say. If you take for granted that, yes, we had simian ancestors that crawled in the trees and all that, but there's no empirical data to substantiate or to justify this statement except that creation is wrong and therefore we came from simpler, lower life forms over vast eons of time. Well, this is what Ian Tattersall said, and I have the update to this book that the quote is from. He said, quote, this story starts with a bang. And he's talking about the story of human evolution. He said, this story starts with a bang, if for no better reason that there are no fossils that document humankind's initial and presumably painful descent from the trees. Boy, you know what? We all know that our tax dollars, our hard-earned tax dollars are being used to teach the next generation that they came from a fish through the evolutionary process of human evolution and all that, right? And that our hard-earned tax dollars are being used in American public schools to print textbooks that teach this fantastical, strange religion called macroevolution, the particles to people, fish to philosopher, molecules to man type of change, right? And that in American public school education that is paid for by our tax dollars, no other alternative is allowed, right? Right, no alternative. It's evolution only. You came from a fish. You came from a fish. You came from a fish. There is no alternative to that. But not only that, but the teacher has been told by school boards, you must teach that as a fact. So let's look at it. Not only is it evolution only, not only will they not tolerate any kind of alternative, and I'm not talking about getting the Bible in public schools. There might be an evolutionist or two here this afternoon. Please mark it down. As a representative of a creation science organization, I say no to teaching the biblical account of creation in American public schools. I'm against it, as we say in Texas. I'm against it. However, I am all in favor of telling the students that there are alternatives to evolution. Is that teaching the Bible? No. You can just say that there's alternatives to the strange doctrine, philosophy of evolution. As a matter of fact, you can teach the alternative to evolution without ever mentioning the Bible or creation. But that's a whole different area, and I'm not going to get into that. But so right now, what we see in American public education is they're using our tax dollars to teach evolution, teach it only evolution, teach it as a scientific fact, plus, and it gets worse, plus the teacher may not teach any problems with evolution, such as, pesky things like the fossil record that does not document macroevolution, or genetics that does not document macroevolution, or anything else associated with it. The teacher may not teach any problems where the teacher would get up and say, well, okay, this is what Darwin's theory of evolution says. However, there are some problems with that. No, we can't do that. Folks, what happened is we have left the arena of education and taken a giant step into the arena of indoctrination. And again, as we say in Texas, I'm against it. I'm all for teaching students, but I'm not in favor of indoctrinating students, which is what evolution is all about in American taxpayer-paid public schools. And so I'm amused that Ian Tattersall, who's somewhat of a loose cannon, you've heard that phrase, Ian Tattersall, I'd urge you to read some of his publications if you're at all interested in human evolution, because as I say, he's a loose cannon. But he admits in print, and I salute him, as saying that there are no fossils. Not that there are a few fossils or there's some shattered remains or anything. He just comes right out and admits there are no fossils that document humankind's initial, and adds a little humor here, presumably painful descent from the trees. So right from the get-go, right from the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, it's an issue of faith, is it not? Because when you observe the unobserved past, or you try to talk about the unobserved past, if you don't even have fossils that would supposedly document that, then it must be taken by faith. Faith not unlike that of who? Creationists, Christians, okay? Remember, was creation a one-time event that occurred in the unobserved past? Yes, it was. Good. I see some people nodding their heads. Creation was a one-time event that occurred in the unobserved past. The evolution of man from a non-human ancestor was what? A one-time event that occurred when? In the unobserved past. That's easy to understand, isn't it? You don't have to be a science major to understand that. So both creation and evolution is on the... We're all in agreement that creation was a one-time event in the unobserved past. Evolution was a one-time event that occurred in the unobserved past. If you walk out here saying, boy, both positions require faith, I would be wrong. I would be remiss. Because there's a little postscript that I'd like to add to that, and that is that ours is a more reasonable faith. Ours is a more reasonable faith. Why? Why, using apologetics that Chris is talking about, why is ours a more reasonable faith? Answer, please write this down, because we have the written record of one who was there when? In the beginning. We have a written record of one who was there in the beginning. The evolutionist has no written record. So yes, both evolution and creation were one-time events that occurred in the unobserved past, but we have a more reasonable faith because we have a written record. It's called the Book of Beginnings, the book of Genesis, 50 chapters. Genesis chapter 12 through 50 can be documented by doing good archaeological research, what we call legal historical research. I'm not talking about science now, I'm talking about legal historical research. How do we know that Lincoln was assassinated in Ford Theater? Well, we put on a white lab coat, go into a laboratory, and no, that's not how we found out that Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, was assassinated in Ford Theater. How do we know? We know that by what we call legal historical evidence, eyewitness accounts, historical narratives, and come to the conclusion, legal historical conclusion, that yes, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Ford Theater. Same situation when we document and validate Genesis chapters 12 through 50. We do that through legal historical research, finding out there are cities, towns, and villages mentioned in Genesis that yes, secular archaeological researchers have documented. Isn't that neat? So if we understand that from Genesis 12 through 50, why not take 1 through 11 by what? By faith, right? By faith. And by the way, it doesn't, God has left us a record, if you will, of the Genesis flood that Chris was talking about. All sorts of evidence of the sedimentary rock units found throughout the world containing trillions of fossils buried in these layers of sedimentary rock. And they're so well buried, it looks like they were buried very rapidly and catastrophically, like you would get with a flood. A flood. And remember, we say floods form fossils fast. So when the theistic evolutionist, bless their heart, tries to buddy up with the evolutionists and say, well, I believe that Jesus is Lord, but I believe he used evolution, there's no room for that according to Genesis 1 through 11. Because what has God done in the very center of those critical chapters? He has put the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5. So if we're to interpret Genesis 1 through 11, as a theistic evolutionist said, by a metaphor or poetical kind of interpretation, why did God put the genealogies right in the center of that? Those boring genealogies that you have to read as you do through the Bible in a year or two? It's because God is trying to tell us that this is an actual historical narrative. And so he has given us documentation of Adam, who is not a metaphor, to none other than the Lord Jesus Christ. So the theistic evolutionist is in a quandary. Did the Lord Jesus Christ, which they have received as their personal Savior for the work that he did on the cross, did Jesus come from a metaphor if you trace it all the way back? That doesn't make any sense. No, God wants us to understand every chapter of his supernatural, God-breathed book of all 66 books. Okay, well, so much for this quote here. But, well, here's the first recorded upright walking human. Ta-da! I thought this was funny. Okay, but there I go thinking again. So what do we know for sure when it comes to human evolution? Please write this down, folks, because there's only two sources that we can draw from to document, supposedly, the evolution of man from ape-like ancestors. The only empirical, and when you see that word, don't be shaken by that word empirical. That just means what we can observe, test, and repeat. So when somebody says to you that's not empirical, that's what they mean. If somebody says to you, for example, ivory soap does not float, and you go, yes it does. No it doesn't. Yes it does. No it doesn't. Stop. Let's conduct an experiment. Right, so you go into the laboratory, you fill a container full of water, measure the temperature, measure the depth, unwrap a bar of ivory soap, plonk in the water, make the what? Observation. Make the observation, write down on your clipboard 2 words. See how easy science is? It floats. You text your friend out on the left coast, and you have them do that experiment using the same parameters. They text back to you, it floats. That's empirical, right? Empirical. And then, of course, there's also science that is in terms of historical science or origin science. And that goes back to my giving the example of it takes faith for both creationists and evolutionists, does it not? But what's the caveat? How soon we forget. What's the caveat? Ours is a more reasonable faith. Why? We have the written record of one who was there in the beginning. So when it comes to human evolution here, we have, number one, mutation rates of particular people in a certain part of the world right now. So you can measure those mutation rates. I have no problem with that. Mutations are real. They're rare, but they're not that rare. Mutations are taking us in a net downward spiral, as John Sanford has written so eloquently in his book on genetic entropy. And then number two, and this is something I really want to park on here this afternoon as we draw to a close here, some fossil bones with no dates on them. I would add to this some shattered fossil bones with no dates on them. That's all we have to draw with, ladies and gentlemen. That's where this huge edifice called human evolution comes from. Mutation rates in a group of people somewhere in the world right now, and shattered bones, for the most part, with no dates on them. And the rest is what? The rest is storytelling. The rest is a spin. A really, really big spin. Trying to convince the public that we came from a fish millions of years ago. So we have to remember that the rest is storytelling 101. And, the bedtime story and all that. So let's talk about the genetic, DNA, genetics. Those who study fossils, that is paleontology, that's what that word means, the study of fossils and molecular clocks looking at DNA and the mutation rate, have a long, uneasy relationship, said Peter Whiff, a paleobotanist at Penn State. I appreciate what he said because it is so true. These two areas are in conflict for the evolutionist. Paleontology, which is a record of the rocks, those shattered remains of pre-human individuals, supposedly, and the measurement of mutation rates that we can in some way document in looking at mutations, and for example, in mitochondrial DNA. I don't want to get too much into that. The two should match if evolution is true. The two should match as we look at both the fossils and the biomolecules like DNA and proteins, if evolution is true, and they don't. They've had what does Peter Wilfear say? A long, uneasy relationship. Please keep that in mind. The mitochondrial timescale. I don't want to get too much into this because I don't want to put everybody to sleep, but Endicott and his fellow authors said in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, volume 24, just very recently, quote, different methodologies and modes of calibration have produced disparate, sometimes irreconcilable reconstructions of the evolutionary and demographic history of our species. Kind of a very flowery way of saying it. But we should be very, very critical and skeptical of these mitochondrial timescales. Okay, Frank, what you're saying, I'm not really going to question, but I've heard over and over again by leading evolutionists that humans and chimpanzees have 98.4% the same DNA. Could I see a show of hands here this afternoon? Who's heard that argument before? Good, thank you. That we have 98.4% the same DNA as chimpanzees. That is an urban legend. That is an urban legend. Would you please write that down? There is absolutely, positively no scientific evidence that that is true. Although that is used over and over again, it is taken on as nothing more than an urban legend. Frank, you're going to have to help me on that. That's what I've heard. I know, I've heard it too. First of all, let's keep something in mind, genomes. And when we say genome, we mean the entire genetic complement of the creature, whether it's a fruit fly or a person. Their entire genetic complement is what we call in biology their genome. Genome, the DNA. But genomes are not recipes. And that's something to keep in mind as we talk about this just for the next few minutes. A creature that shares 98.4% of DNA with humans is not 98.4% human any more than fish that share, say, 40% is 40% human. And there are fish that have 40% the same DNA that we have. But you never have any problem making a distinction between you and that fish, even though there's 40% the same DNA. Well, I guess well, I guess there's something to that. Did you know that we share half of our genes with a banana? 50% of our DNA is just like a banana. So that person sitting next to you right now, is that person half a banana? Is that banana you had for breakfast on your flakes this morning, was that half a person? Well, that's silly. That's ridiculous. And the argument used to be that, yeah, we have so much of our DNA that's the same as a chimpanzee. We must have come from a chimpanzee. But one doesn't follow the other. We do have about 70% of our DNA that is as similar as a chimpanzee. And guess what? The evolutionists are absolutely silent on that. Because when you get anywhere below about 80% or even 85%, the evolutionists clam up. They don't say anything about it because they know as well as we know that if you share only 70% of the same DNA as a chimpanzee, you cannot make the argument that that's our evolutionary ancestor. After all, we're right behind the banana in terms of our so-called evolutionary ancestry. Listen, yeah, we do have 70% the same DNA as a chimpanzee, just like we have about 70% the same DNA as a mouse or a rat or some other large tetrapod, a mammal. Why? Why? Well, mice, rats, chimpanzees, rhinoceroses, zebras, do we all breathe the same air? Help me out. Do we all breathe the same air? Yeah, okay. Do we all drink the same water? Yeah. Do we all basically eat the same food? Yeah. Well, look, if we breathe the same air, drink the same water, eat the same food, that means, and this gets into my field a little bit of biochemistry and organic chemistry and what it takes to undergo something called metabolism to produce energy. Well, you need a whole bunch of enzymes, and there's nothing simple about enzymes, which are protein molecules that have very, very specific folding associated with them, and I alluded to that a little bit last night. Take, for example, what I used to teach in my pre-med majors. It's called respiratory physiology. Respiratory physiology, there's nothing simple about the enzymatic reaction. Every time you take a breath, you draw breath through your trachea, down into your lungs, into the alveoli, and the alveoli makes that critical transition of carbon dioxide-oxygen ratio through the red blood cells that become permeated with oxygen as they, at the same time, give up carbon dioxide. It's a very, very sophisticated cycle with all sorts of enzymes that are involved. Well, that happens in chimpanzees and rats and mice and zebras and rhinoceroses and everything else. It's the same basic process, using the same kinds of enzymes which are coded for by DNA. So yes, the DNA would be similar, and the same thing goes for foods that we eat. What are the big three foods that we eat? Well, there's carbohydrates, and there's proteins, and there's fats. Fats are important. Cholesterol is important in your diet. If you don't have enough cholesterol, guess what? Your liver starts to make it. And so there's good and bad cholesterol. But the point is this, that we need those foods to be broken down to provide energy. And if we didn't have the enzymes, it would take about a century to digest the delicious sandwiches that we had this afternoon. We don't have that kind of time. And so God has given us very specific enzymes that effect that transition from the food we eat through what we call the hepatic portal system that gets first shot at everything we eat and is absorbed, carried to our 70-plus trillion cells, and then the energy is produced. But all of that requires enzymes which are the same, whether you're a zebra, a rat, or a person. So, of course, a lot of that DNA is going to be the same. Well, then we come to the myth of the 98.4 or 5% common DNA. Look what this secular researcher said in 2007. This is back in 2007, where a secular evolutionary researcher, here it is, a quote of the afternoon, quote, for about 23% of our genome, we share no, underline that word, no immediate genetic ancestry with our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. So we can see that this is a refreshingly frank statement made by an evolutionist. He still believes that we came from a chimpanzee, but he is intellectually honest to admit that we share no immediate genetic ancestry with what he feels is our closest living relative. So this is a quote of the afternoon right here. Don't let anybody tell you that we have 98.6% the same DNA as a chimpanzee. That is an urban legend. It is now clear that the genetic differences between people and chimps are far more extensive than previously thought. Their genomes are not 98 or 99% identical. That comes from an evolutionist from the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences way back in 2012, well, just a couple of years ago. And so this idea that we are so very closely related to a chimpanzee is, again, without getting too redundant, an urban legend. Okay, switching gears. Let's look at evaluating fossil bones. It's something called paleoanthropology, a 50-cent word here. And it simply means a study of so-called human evolution using the fossil record. And we see the various hominid skulls. This is kind of a dated picture here, but it gives you an idea of where evolutionists were getting their ideas that we came from lower life forms, the chimpanzees and the ape-like simian creatures and so forth. The two top ones there are Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man, we've all read about this in the past, and of course it's not in the textbooks anymore. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, back a century ago, maybe a little, well, not a century, but 70 years ago, 80 years ago, Piltdown Man was presented to the American public and the public at large throughout the world as evidence that we came from an ape-like ancestor. It was splashed on the cover of magazines. Here it is, your ancestor. So that's the reason why I put Piltdown Man there, is because it fooled so many people for so long. And we should be very, very critical of such grandiose statements when they come along, especially when it applies to human evolution. Same situation, the Nebraska Man, we've heard about that, scientifically built up from the single tooth of what was found later to be an extinct pig. And we kind of smile at that, but again, it shows that we should be very, very critical and not quickly to accept some of these evolutionary arguments. Australopithecus, kind of a tongue twister of a word there. If we break down that word Australopithecus, Australo means southern, Pithecus means ape. So put it together, it's southern ape. And we maintain as non-Darwinists that that's exactly what Australopithecus afarensis was, Australopithecus africanus, that they were simply apes. Australopithecus, like, who has heard of Lucy? You heard Lucy? Okay. Lucy is Australopithecus afarensis. And Lucy had ape-like arms, ape-like legs, ape-like fingers. That's what we call these in Texas, right? Fingers. Okay. What do you call them here in Washington? But anyway, fingers. And everything about Lucy was ape-like, even an ape-like skull, ape-like brain. Everything about Lucy was ape-like. Well, why in the world did they say Lucy was our evolutionary ancestor? Well, the idea was that Lucy walked upright on occasion, upright walking posture, and they pointed to her pelvis. That was incomplete, but it was complete enough to see that supposedly she may have walked upright. Although, remember, she had been dead for millions of years, several million years. So nobody actually saw Lucy walking upright. That's what there was conjectured, hypothesis was. Well, as non-Darwinists, we said, look, if you want to see something that walks upright, go to the San Diego Zoo. And San Diego Zoo, you will see the living pygmy chimpanzee, which is now called Bonbo, I think. Bonbo. It's not really the pygmy chimpanzee anymore. They've just renamed it. But that walks upright about 10% of the time. You can tell she doesn't enjoy it, but they can walk upright on occasion. So upright walking in itself doesn't really mean anything. And then, of course, the Neanderthal. When I was in school, Neanderthals were the big deal. But Neanderthal, although it had a heavy brow ridge, and there were some traits and characteristics of the skull which were quite unique, Neanderthals were 100% human being. As a matter of fact, they had the same cranial kind of design as, for example, the Eskimos, who have a very heavy brow ridge and all that. But nobody is saying Neanderthals evolved into human beings. Evolutionists, I believe, call them an extinct side branch. So here's a primitive spelling bee. Cave, C-A-V-E, cave. Oh, sure, I'll probably get Australopithecus. Okay, got to keep awake here. So there's controversy and questionable fossil evidence. And C. Loring Brace at the University of Michigan, who's no friend of the creationist, he is dead set against creation science, said, and I quote, "Creationists have consistently misunderstood or misrepresented the nature of the fossil record of human evolution." And he gets really emotional about that. And by the way, he's one that does believe in this linear progression, this evolution from an ape-like creature to the Wall Street businessman or businesswoman. And the reason why creationists speak of the fossils not supporting human evolution is because, okay, now this is quite an accusation that C. Loring Brace of Michigan has said about us, yours truly. And so the reason why we say what we say, even though it gets C. Loring Brace upset, is from old little quotes like this, from a book published way back in the year 2015, where the author, who is an evolutionist, Michael Benton, said, and I quote, "Unfortunately, the fossil evidence for human evolution is patchy. There has been a great deal," he didn't say some, he said a great deal of controversy over primate and human relationships. So when C. Loring Brace says, boy, creationists have consistently misunderstood and misrepresented the nature of the fossil record of human evolution, we do that because of the next quote on the same screen there, from a guy who is not a creationist, but is a very top-notch paleontologist who is, again, I use the phrase, intellectually honest to admit that there's a great deal of controversy over primate and human relationships. Folks, it's not just those unscientific creationists who are saying that. It's C. Loring Brace's colleagues who are saying that. And that's another take-home point to be made as we draw to a close here this afternoon. This comes from Nature Magazine, volume 497. Nature Magazine is a creme de la creme, the top of the top, the best of the best when it comes to secular science publications. You just don't get any better than Nature Magazine. It's a British publication. And they said the evolutionary events that led to the origin, there's that word again, remember Darwin's infamous book? That led to the origin of the Homo lineage are in an enduring puzzle in paleoanthropology, which you saw that word before, chiefly because the fossil record from between 3 million and 2 million years ago is frustratingly sparse. Take note, please, C. Loring Brace of Michigan, especially, he says, in Eastern Africa. Well, this is from Ed Yong, who's a science writer for New Scientist magazine. New Scientist is also a British atheistic scientific publication, and he said in 2011, "We thought we had just about nailed human evolution. Now everything is up for grabs again." And this is in the 21st century when he said this, years after Darwin's not-so-famous second book. Does anybody know the name of Darwin's second book, which just hardly created a blip on the radar screen? It's called The Descent of Man, and he tried to talk about human evolution in his second book, and as I say, it's not so popular as a first book, not by a long shot, because so much about what he wrote then was not correct. So we thought we had nailed human evolution, but now everything is up for grabs again. Relatively little is known of early Homo species, Hawks point out, and the story could be more complicated. That was said back in the year 2013, just 3 short years ago. Relatively little is known about the early Homo species, and a far more complicated story. Bernard Wood, who is a big name in human evolution, said, "The origin," and there's that word again, "the origin of our own genus remains what? Frustratingly unclear." Frustratingly unclear. Without being redundant, remember what we say in creation science circles? It will always be frustratingly unclear. They will never come to a condition where they'll say, wow, all the questions are answered. Here is this progression, this bush or whatever you want to call it, that shows that we definitively have come from an ape-like ancestor. Here are the dates. Here's the scientific evidence. It's all finished. Based on the book of beginnings, Genesis chapter 1, they will never, ever say that, because the scientific evidence is simply not there. This is a cover of Scientific American, and this is what Kate Wong said. This is just 4 years ago. She said, "But with so little evidence to go on, the origin of our genus has remained as mysterious as ever." Can I suggest something this afternoon? Remember those textbooks I mentioned to you that are used in American public schools? Who pays for those textbooks? We do. We pay for those textbooks. Those textbooks that teach the impressionable young mind that they came from a fish over millions and millions of years. I'm again it. I think in something that we call American public school education, we all should be able to discuss this, right? Isn't that what education is all about? Listening to all points of view and entertaining discussion and all. Not being lectured to, but it was an education, not indoctrination. And so with that in mind, wouldn't it be neat? Wouldn't it be neat if we could take a quote like this from a lady who is not a creationist, from Scientific American, who the editor has just spoken out against Christians and against creation. And if you take this quote here, and can we not put that in the nice, wide, white margin of the section of that biology textbook that discusses human evolution? Can we not take that quote and put it right there in that wide margin? There's lots of room there. Any problem with the civil libertarians, so-called? They couldn't possibly get upset by putting that quote in there because there's no Bible in it, right? There's no alternative to evolutionary teaching. It is simply telling the students, and this is where the word education comes in, it's simply telling the student that there's some problems with this idea of you coming from lower life forms over millions and millions of years. And so for the last dozen or so quotes that you've seen me share here this afternoon, any one of those quotes should be able to be taken and put into the section on human evolution in American taxpayer-paid public school textbooks. And really, the evolutionist couldn't say no, because there's no Bible in there, there's no allusion to the supernatural, no allusion to any alternative to evolution. It's simply that the students would be able to see the rest of the scientific story. This is from back in the year 2016, where it says, fossil finds in China are challenging ideas about the evolution of modern humans and our closest relatives. And notice a publication. It's Nature magazine. Did I mention that? The best of the best, the top of the heap. Wouldn't it be refreshing that the student could read that quote way back in the year 2016 in their biology textbook on the section on human evolution? Hey, why not? Why not? Lee Berger was the one who discovered Homo nadli, and it was really kind of turned upside down the evolutionary community in terms of human evolution. But he spoke very candidly this summer in 2016 about paleoanthropology. Again, the word that we've seen several times now this afternoon. And Lee Berger said that it's a competitive sport. I thought it was supposed to be science. But Lee Berger refreshingly said in this article that it's a competitive sport. Wow. Can you imagine if a creationist said that about creation science? Well, ladies and gentlemen, creation science is really a competitive sport. You'd never hear the end of it. In regard to members of the human family 50,000 years ago, I don't believe that for a second. No pun intended. Nature magazine states, who were these ancestors? Question mark. They left few fossils and fewer answers. Wow, this is another wonderful quote that can be put into American taxpayer-paid public school textbooks. So let's look at some of the missing link candidates very quickly. I'll go through these rapidly. You can see these online in various creation science sources. Dr. White said Artie's species could be the ancestor of Lucy, which could be, notice the could be's there, the could be's, the ancestor of humans. Without additional fossil evidence, however, connecting the individual or species dots is hazardous. So much for Artie. And despite 600 pages of material submitted to Science magazine in October of 2009, many doubts and questions remain about the status of this hominid or hominoid or whatever it was. And again, Ian Tattersall has a discussion of hominids and hominoids I don't have time to get into this afternoon in his very, very interesting 2009 book. Cedar Is that a transitional form? Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History paleoanthropologist Rick Potts is uncertain as to how Australopithecus sediba relevant to the origin of Homo, especially since the earliest Homo fossils are hundreds of thousands of years older. So now we have a problem with overlap, a child being born before the parent. And that was said just 3 years ago. None of the experts I spoke to this week, and this is back in 2010, were ready to accept Berger's hypothesis about Australopithecus sediba's special place in the hominid tree. Evolutionist Carl Zimmer said, it might actually belong to a different branch of hominid evolution. It may have, there it is again, may have evolved its Homo-like traits independently of our own ancestors. So it is carved in jello, not in stone. Here's Homo naledi. And naledi has made a big splash just a couple of months ago. There are key mysteries with these shattered fossil bones of maybe 15 individuals. They're just guessing because the bones are so shattered. They suspect it might be about 15 individuals, and they don't know how old the bones are. Well, folks, if you cannot date the bones and put a good solid date on the bones, how can you say one is the ancestor of the other? You don't know the dates. Rick Potts, and we just saw his name earlier, he's a big name in human evolution, director of human origins programs at the Smithsonian, who's not involved in the discovery, I have to emphasize that, said that without an age, quote, there's no way we can judge the evolutionary significance of this find. Rick Potts, who is diametrically opposed to creation science. And finally, Lee Berger, we saw his name earlier, who led the work, said researchers are not claiming that Nadli was a direct ancestor of modern day people. How about that? After all the dust has settled, after all the brouhaha has calmed down and the champagne corks have finished popping, they're not saying it's an ancestor to modern man. What's the big deal? So I thought that was kind of interesting. And what about Neanderthals? How are we doing for time? I got 3 minutes? Okay. It's official. Neanderthals had culture and creativity. Neanderthals made jewelry that the proteins confirm, writes Lizzie Wade for Science Magazine, September of 2016. A landmark study of old artifacts in France upsets the old myth of stupid Neanderthals. Everything about Neanderthals seems to be human-like. Everything. As a matter of fact, they had a cranial capacity exceeding that of humans. So whatever Neanderthals were, and they were a strange group of individuals, I'll grant. But they had all the traits and characteristics of a 100% human being. Thomas Hagman of the University of Oxford in England said, quote, I think it is quite possible that Neanderthals were capable of making and using personal ornaments. Animals don't do that. We don't know yet. What we don't yet know is whether there was at least a short overlap in the populations, thus raising the question once again of the possible role of modern humans in the extinction of Homo florensis, says Chris Stringer. Chris Stringer is another big name in human evolution studies. And if hobbits and humans overlapped, they might even have interbred. Well, back years ago, when hobbits were first discovered, Homo florensis, it was suggested they were our ancestors, but now they're finding out that people and these hobbits, whatever Homo florensis was, lived at the same time. How could one be the ancestor of the other? And then very quickly, we are out of time. DNA makes clear that Homo erectus was almost certainly a dead end and not, as some scientists have argued, our ancestor. This is a big deal in the 1980s. Homo erectus was our evolutionary ancestor, and yet here we have Newsweek magazine, no friend of the creationist, writing in 2007 that DNA makes clear that Homo erectus, such a big deal in the 80s, was almost certainly a dead end and not our evolutionary ancestor. This comes from Miller and Levine's biology textbook, the most popular high school biology textbook in the country today, I believe. I'm pretty sure that's a correct statement. And here you find in the black circles there, Homo erectus, Homo erectus. Well, if they say now that Homo erectus is not our evolutionary ancestor, all of a sudden, look down below Homo erectus there. Do you see Homo sapiens? Man is standing in splendid isolation between the apes at the top there and Homo sapiens, which is what we are at the bottom there, and they have removed Homo erectus as our so-called ancestor. Just like the Bible, and I'll conclude with this, ladies and gentlemen, people have always been people, and as the research has continued and been conducted, we find that people have stood in splendid isolation when it comes to the creation-evolution controversy. People have always been people, and apes have always been apes. So we read in the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, God has created each and every one of us in his image to have fellowship with him through the person of Jesus Christ. We cannot point to any kind of evolutionary ancestry anywhere, since God has created after their kind. Well, folks, this weekend has been just refreshing, as we say in Texas. It's been a tonic. It has been so good to be able to fellowship. I've seen a number of people here that I've seen from from years past, and so it's always good to make connection again and to have some fellowship, and as we say in Texas, to be laughing and scratching again. I appreciate that you have spent your Saturday with us here, and I trust that we'll be able to do this again in the not too distant future. And I really do appreciate the time we've had, and I think Chris, we should acknowledge Chris as all the hard work that he has done in bringing this together.
So Frank, we could allow you to field a couple of questions if you're up for it. I think you did finish a few minutes early, so although we're past our official closing time, I don't...
If we all came from fish, where did the fish come from?
That's a good question. And, of course, you'd have to ask the evolutionists that, because I would maintain fish have always been fish. People have always been people. And, they say, as a matter of fact, I have a quote here in this presentation here this afternoon where I have an evolutionist who says that we are just highly evolved fish and that these are not arms and legs. Imagine what a shock that is for me. I taught human anatomy and physiology for years in Pensacola. And he said these are not arms and legs. He said these are highly modified pelvic girdle fins. And so these are not arms and legs, they're fins. Because he is so absolutely convinced that we came from lower life forms.
I've read in Wayne Frere's book and elsewhere about the foramen magnum that goes through the bottom of the skull or the side of the skull to identify whether it's apes or hominoid. Can you answer a question? Is there any evidence for any of these intermediates to classify one or the other?
Yeah, the foramen magnum, foramen means a hole, and the magnum means big. So the big hole where the spinal cord goes up into the brain. You have the brain and spinal cord that makes the vertebrate so characteristic. The foramen magnum is a little bit different anatomically in one than the other, but as far as being an intermediate, as it supposedly made the transition, I don't believe I've ever seen that in the literature or the pictures. So that's a very good question, very good question. You have the foramen magnum for ape-like creatures, which is quite different in terms of a physical location than Homo sapiens, where we have been designed to walk upright. So, good point. I don't know of any transition there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, couldn't help but notice that you didn't make any mention of Ida, even though that one came in with great fanfare.
What is it again?
Ida, the lemur.
Oh. Yeah, I guess that's kind of off the radar screen there. Now, if we're talking about a lemur, yeah, lemurs, supposedly, according to evolutionary theory, are ancient ancestors, and so I was staying more in tune with the something a little bit more recent than. And the reason why they say lemurs is because they have such large, sophisticated eyes, and I believe their evolutionists are saying that their forearms are well developed and all that, but that's a stretch. I mean, it's a real stretch. Lemurs are cute and cuddly, but they're not our evolutionary ancestor.
Would it be possible for a transition to happen? Like, is there physical barriers that would prevent a transition to happen because of issues when a transition may try to occur? Like, is there physical characteristics that make the transition not functional? If you transition an ape-like creature to a humanoid-like creature, would that actually work?
Don't think I'm quite following on that. Are you talking about like geographical or physical barriers?
I'm talking about anatomical barriers that prevent
Oh,
the body plan of a translation would not work, wouldn't
yeah.
it?
Okay, that's a good point. That has to do with something called irreducible complexity. If I'm with you on the same page there, is that it has to be all or none. Michael Behe gives the example of a mousetrap. You got to have all the parts working together to catch that mouse, and something that's a transition between a non-functional a mousetrap and a mousetrap that works. You know, one works and one doesn't. And so when it comes to making the transition between functional parts of a body anatomically, if I'm reading you correctly, it's no good to have, as Stephen Gould used to say, half an eye or half a wing. Well, we can talk about it later. Yeah, come on up. We'll discuss that later. All the parts that we have work and function perfectly. Let me just say one thing just very quickly about molars, our wisdom teeth. Remember, the argument was that you had to have your wisdom teeth out because of the evolution of the jaw. There's such a perfect example, explanation for that from a creation science perspective. Did you ever notice in third world countries, they don't have to have their wisdom teeth out? Why? Because they have such a robust diet. They chew, and chewing is called mastication in zoology. They chew and they stimulate the production and the growth and development of the mandible, which is the jawbone. And so they don't run into the problem that we run into here in the industrialized nations in the West, where the most formidable thing that we eat is whipped cream and cream puffs and, you know, Jell-O and stuff like that. We never stimulate the jaw to develop fully, and therefore when you have this eruption sequence of teeth coming in, they get crowded, and it causes what we call in dentition a pathology. But you don't have that in third world countries. And so I remember the doctor that I had in the Navy, and this is a true story, the dentist said, your wisdom teeth have to come out. And I was just a E5 in the Navy. And so he looked at his calendar and he said, this day right here. Guess what day it was? Thanksgiving. Guess what time I had to get my teeth out? 6 a.m. on board the USS Constellation. Then they ask you to re-enlist. I love it. And so, teeth have always been teeth, and they're, evolutionarily speaking, there is no indication of how teeth evolved from a non-tooth ancestor. What time do you go to see the dentist? What time? Tooth hurty. Next question.
I heard somewhere, again, if you can confirm this, that Europeans have 2% Neanderthal DNA. If that's true, then they can't be a separate thing, but they must have interbred to begin with. Is there any...
Yeah, I've heard that before. I'd have to see the scientific publication where that's been documented. That's been suggested. There doesn't seem to be any indication that people in Neanderthals interbred, although no, I take that back. There's a guy in France who's been living in France, the same area. His whole family's been living there for decades and decades, and supposedly they have found some DNA in his genetic makeup, in his genome. So there might be something to that. But again, we are hardly surprised by that because, like we said, Neanderthals were 100% humans. And so we're not really surprised about that. I want to know how we came from some ape-like ancestor, allegedly millions of years ago. That's a good point.
Thank Frank Sherwin one more time. Thank you much.